Everyone feared the blind mafia boss until his new assistant spoke to him like a man. The call came at 2:47 in the morning. Seo Do-hwan didn't bother with pleasantries. He never did. His men had just dragged a woman out of a parking garage in the rain, and he wanted Kang Tae-jun to know exactly what that felt like, to have something precious ripped away in the dark, without warning, without mercy, the same way Tae-jun's people had dismantled 3 of Do-hwan's waterfront contracts in a single week. She screamed, Do-hwan said, his voice almost gentle, almost amused. Your little assistant, she fought harder than I expected. You should be proud. There was a pause. Then the sound of a woman's sharp, controlled breathing, someone working very hard not to give him the satisfaction of hearing her cry. You have 24 hours, Do-hwan said, or she stops breathing in that building. He hung up before Tae-jun could respond. If you were sitting in that penthouse, listening to silence where her voice used to be, what would you do? Would you call in an army? Would you negotiate? Would you fall apart? Because Kang Tae-jun, a man who had survived a warehouse explosion, lost both eyes, rebuilt an empire from nothing, sat completely still in the dark for 11 seconds. And then he picked up his phone and made exactly one call. He didn't call Minho. He called her desk extension, out of habit, out of something he wasn't willing to name yet. It rang 4 times before he set the phone down. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled, because what happens next, you will not see coming. 3 months before Do-hwan made that call, Seattle was soaked in the kind of February rain that had no interest in stopping. It came down sideways. It turned every street into a slow river, and it had been doing exactly that for 11 consecutive days when Imani Whitaker stood outside the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower with a damp folder pressed to her chest, and the very specific expression of a woman who had already talked herself out of leaving twice on the elevator ride up. She had almost not come. That was the honest truth, and Imani was, above most things, honest with herself. She had seen the job listing 3 times before responding to it, and she'd responded only because her landlord had stopped being polite about the overdue rent, and because her savings account contained exactly enough money to cover groceries for 11 more days if she was careful about it. The listing had been strange. Executive Administrative Coordinator. Immediate start. Exceptional discretion required. Compensation. Above market rate. No company name. No job description beyond those 4 lines. The response email that came back within 2 hours was from a man named Minho Kwon, who gave her an address, a time, and a single sentence that had stuck in her head ever since she read it. Please understand that previous candidates found the position challenging. Challenging. Right. She had done her research. Of course she had. Imani did research the way other people drank coffee, compulsively, and before anything else could happen. What she found when she dug behind the shell companies and the shipping subsidiaries and the waterfront investment firms was a name, Kang Tae-jun, 34 years old, born in Busan, South Korea, raised in Seattle, legitimate real estate holdings, multiple warehouses along the waterfront, partial ownership in 3 private hospitality clubs. Clean record. Too clean. The kind of clean that took significant money to maintain. She had almost backed out then, except the landlord had sent a 3rd message, this one with language that was considerably less polite, and Imani had thought about her mother, who had worked 2 jobs for 22 years and never once complained, and she had straightened her blazer, squared her shoulders, and taken the elevator up. Minho Kwon met her in the hallway outside a set of double walnut doors that looked like they cost more than her entire apartment building. He was compact, precise, Korean-American, maybe 30, with an expression that lived permanently somewhere between professional and exhausted. He looked her over once, not in a way that felt disrespectful, more in the way a man looks at someone he is quietly calculating risk for. And then he said, without any warm-up, 3 things. Don't move anything on his desk. Don't enter his personal space without announcing yourself first. And don't... He paused, as if choosing the word carefully. Don't accommodate him. You understand what I mean by that? Imani looked at him. You mean don't treat him like he can't handle himself. Something shifted in Minho's face, just barely. He's had 11 assistants in 14 months. What happened to them? 8 quit, 2 had anxiety attacks. One tried to rearrange his filing system without asking and walked out of that office looking like she'd seen something she'd never fully recover from. Imani processed that. What happened to his filing system? Nothing. He noticed within 4 minutes, by sound. Minho straightened his already straight jacket. He will test you immediately. He does it with everyone. Don't try to pass the test. Don't try to be impressive. Just be accurate. He opened the door. The office was enormous and deliberately dark. Heavy curtains had been drawn across windows that, in any other building, would have showcased the entire Seattle skyline, the water, the mountains, the city lights bleeding through the rain. Instead, the room existed in a controlled dimness, the only illumination coming from recessed floor lighting that cast everything in long, careful shadows. The furniture was expensive and precisely arranged. The air smelled faintly of cedar and black coffee and something almost like iron. Behind a desk the size of a small country sat Kang Tae-jun. Imani had seen photographs from before the accident. He'd been striking even then. Angular jaw, broad shoulders, the kind of presence that read clearly in still images. 3 years later, the explosion had left a scar that ran from his left temple down across his eye and along his cheekbone, ragged at the edges the way burns always were, permanent and unignorable. Both eyes were closed, not in sleep, in stillness. He heard her enter. She knew that because his chin lifted slightly, and the rest of him went completely motionless in the way a predator goes motionless when it has identified exactly where a sound is coming from. He didn't say anything for 7 full seconds. Imani didn't fill the silence. She'd learned young that people who needed you to fill silence were people who wanted to watch you scramble, and she had no interest in scrambling for anyone. "Describe the room," he said finally. His voice was lower than she'd expected, not soft. Nothing about Kang Tae-jun was soft, but controlled in the way that things under significant pressure are controlled, like he chose every word the way a man chooses where to put his foot when the ground beneath him isn't trustworthy. Imani looked around the room carefully. Then she said, "Gloomy, unnecessarily expensive. There's a walnut desk that probably cost more than I've made in the last 2 years combined, and it's facing northeast, which means you've got your back to the windows on purpose. Your chair has armrests that look like they've been gripped a lot. The credenza behind you has everything labeled in what I'm guessing is Braille, but the labels are slightly uneven, like someone else put them on in a hurry. There's a coffee stain near the left corner of your desk that's been there long enough to set, and your tie is crooked." Silence. "Which direction?" he asked. "Pulling left? About half an inch?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then he said, "The credenza labels were placed by my previous assistant. She did it without asking." "I know," Imani said. "They're also in the wrong order. If you're reading them left to right, the 3rd and 4th drawers are switched." Another silence. Longer this time. "You're not afraid," he said. "I'm terrified," Imani said. "But I'm more behind on rent than I've ever been in my life, and that's currently a bigger problem than you are." She watched the muscles in his jaw work through something. His right hand, which had been resting flat on the desk, curled slowly and then opened again. He was recalibrating. She could almost see it happening. The man sorting through a response category that he didn't have preloaded because nobody talked to him this way. Nobody had in a long time. "Sit down," he said. There was one chair in front of the desk. Imani sat. He asked her 4 questions. Not about her qualifications. He clearly already had those, or Minho did. He asked her what she had noticed about the hallway on the way in. He asked her to read 3 lines from a document on the edge of his desk aloud, without summarizing, without editorializing, exactly as written. He asked her to tell him what Minho's expression had looked like when he opened the door. And he asked her what she had found when she researched him before the interview. She answered all 4 honestly, including the last one. "I found clean records attached to subsidiaries that don't have a strong reason to exist," she said. "And I found that the people attached to your organization professionally tend to stop appearing in public records after a certain point. I didn't look too far. It wasn't my business to look too far. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend I didn't look at all." He was quiet for a moment. "And you came anyway." "The rent situation is genuinely very serious," Imani said. For the second time in the conversation, something happened in Tae-jun's face that she couldn't quite name. It wasn't a smile, it was too complicated and too brief to be a smile. But it involved a fractional change around his mouth that felt like the shadow of one. Gone before it fully arrived. "You start Monday," he said. "It's Monday," Imani said. "Then you start now." She had barely set her bag down when Minho appeared again with a stack of shipping manifests, 3 revenue reports, and a calendar so dense it looked like a punishment. Tae-jun dictated, and Imani wrote. He spoke quickly and expected her to keep up. She kept up. He asked for a specific document from the credenza, 3rd drawer, and she retrieved it and read 2 pages aloud without stumbling once. He asked her to cross-reference a number from the manifest with a number from the financial summary, and she found the discrepancy in under a minute. Tae-jun tilted his head when she told him. "Read that column again." She did. "And the corresponding purchase order." She flipped to it and read. $12,000, he said. Not to her, really. More to the air, to the information itself. "Missing. Looks like it's been routed through a subsidiary that has the same naming convention as a legitimate freight company," Imani said. "But the registration date is 6 months newer, easy to miss if you're just skimming." Tae-jun said nothing for a long time, then, "You have a financial background." "Accounting degree. Never used it for anything exciting." "You're using it now." Minho appeared in the doorway at 4 in the afternoon and looked at the two of them. Tae-jun leaning slightly forward with his hands flat on the desk. Imani sitting across from him with her notepad covered in precise handwriting and 3 separate documents organized into a logical sequence nobody had asked her to organize. And his expression did something complicated before returning to neutral. He met Imani in the hallway at the end of the day. 8 days, he said quietly. "That's the longest anyone has lasted." "How long was I in there?" Minho checked his watch. 6 hours and 40 minutes. Imani looked at the double walnut doors. "He's not what I expected." "No," Minho said. "He's worse, and he's better, depending on the day." He paused. "You found the subsidiary discrepancy." "It was right there in the numbers. 3 accountants reviewed those reports before you. None of them said anything." Imani pulled on her coat. Maybe they were afraid to. She was almost at the elevator when Minho called after her, voice low enough that the sound barely reached her. "Don't get comfortable, and don't get attached." He said it the way a person says something they know is already too late to say. "This place has a way of, it gets complicated. For people who actually pay attention." Imani pressed the elevator button. "Everything complicated pays better than everything simple," she said. "That's been true my whole life." She went home, paid the landlord enough to buy herself 3 more weeks of grace, and made herself a meal that wasn't bought in a panic, for the first time in 2 months. She sat at her kitchen table and looked at the notes she'd taken during the day. 6 pages of them, dense and organized. And she thought about a man sitting behind a massive walnut desk in a deliberately darkened room, ruling an empire he couldn't see, and surviving it through sheer compressed will. She thought about the way he'd said, "You start now." Not a question, not an offer, a decision made. She understood that instinct better than she wanted to admit. The second week was harder than the first. Not because Tae-jun was cruel. He wasn't, not in any way she could have predicted. He was exacting. There was a difference. He expected precision, speed, accuracy, and absolute discretion. And when he didn't get those things, the temperature in the room dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the thermostat. Everything here is noticed. Everything here means something. When you give a frightened man his jacket, jacket, it tells everyone in this building something about your judgment. What does it tell them? Tae-jun was quiet for a moment. "That you have some," he said finally. The way he said it was slightly different from his normal delivery. Less directed outward, more like something that had come out without full approval from whatever internal checkpoint he ran everything through first. He returned to his desk. She returned to hers, the smaller one off to the side where she'd established, without anyone officially sanctioning it, her working territory. By the end of the second week, she had quietly corrected the credenza labels. She'd mentioned it to him first. That was the rule, announce before you act. And he'd been silent for a moment and then said, "Use the existing format," which was the closest thing to permission she was going to get, and she had redone them precisely, in the correct sequence, And the next morning, when he reached for the third drawer without hesitating, something in the economy of that single gesture told her she'd done it right. She didn't mention it. He didn't thank her. And somehow that felt exactly correct. 3 weeks in, Imani made an error. She transposed 2 numbers in a summary report. An honest mistake, the kind anyone makes after an 8-hour stretch of dense financial data. And Tae-jun caught it during a meeting with 2 of his senior captains. He didn't embarrass her. He didn't even correct it aloud. He simply paused, asked her to reread the figure, and when she did, she caught it herself and corrected it in the same breath. After the meeting, when they were alone, she said, "I'm sorry, that was sloppy." He said it was a transposition. You caught it yourself. You caught it first. "I count differently than you do," he said. "I do everything differently than you do. That's not a criticism. It's a fact." He picked up his coffee. "Don't apologize for being human. Apologize when you stop caring about accuracy. Those are different things." Imani looked at him. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said, and went back to the document she'd been reading to him when the captains arrived. That night she sat with her phone in her hand and almost called her best friend Kaya, who had been calling her every few days to check whether she was still alive and working for who she thought she was working for. She almost explained the whole thing. The darkness, the scar, the voice that controlled an entire criminal infrastructure, and the fact that behind all of it was a man who corrected her differently than anyone had ever corrected her before. She didn't call. Some things needed to stay with her a little longer before they became stories. She put the phone down, made tea she didn't drink, and sat at her kitchen table thinking about the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower, and the man in the dark, and the 11 people who had left before her. And she thought, very quietly, in a part of herself she wasn't fully ready to examine, "I'm not leaving." She wasn't sure yet whether that was brave or reckless. She suspected it might be both. The morning after she decided she wasn't leaving, Imani arrived 7 minutes early. She knew it was 7 minutes because she'd checked her phone in the elevator and then immediately felt ridiculous for caring. She wasn't the kind of person who tracked her own punctuality like it was a performance. She was the kind of person who showed up when she said she would, and expected the same from everyone around her, which was, she had come to understand, an expectation that the world found exhausting. The hallway outside Tae-jun's office was empty, except for a junior operative named Cho, mid-20s, quiet, perpetually stationed near the stairwell door like a piece of furniture that had learned to breathe, who gave her a nod that contained approximately 4 different meanings she hadn't fully decoded yet. She nodded back and went in. Tae-jun was already at his desk. Of course he was. She was beginning to suspect he didn't sleep in any location that required him to travel far from that desk in the morning. His coffee was already poured. His jacket was already on. The only thing that wasn't precisely in order was a single folder sitting open in the center of his desk at a slight angle, as if he'd set it down in the middle of reading it, and then remembered he couldn't. He heard her the moment the door opened. "The manifest from the Portland terminal came in at midnight," he said, before she'd fully entered the room. "Cross-reference it with the cargo weight declarations from the November shipments. There's something wrong with the tonnage reporting." Imani set her bag down, took off her coat, and pulled the folder toward her without responding to the greeting he hadn't given her, because he hadn't given her one, and she'd stopped expecting it 6 days ago. She read. She cross-referenced. It took her 22 minutes, during which Tae-jun took 2 phone calls in Korean, ended both of them in under 90 seconds each, and refilled his own coffee without spilling any of it, which she had noticed he was meticulous about. The coffee, the cup, the exact position of both on the desk's surface. He knew that desk the way surgeons know their own hands. "The tonnage discrepancy is in the third-party container declarations," she said. "Whoever is filing them is inflating the weight on export and deflating on import. The difference isn't huge per shipment, but if I run the average across the last 4 months," she did the calculation in her head, checked it twice. "It comes to roughly $42,000 routed in a direction that doesn't connect to any of your accounts." Silence. Not his processing silence, something different, something colder. "Whose containers?" he said. It wasn't a question with a rising inflection. It was a demand delivered as a statement. "They're registered to a forwarding company called Seagate Pacific, but Seagate Pacific's contact person for all the paperwork is..." She checked the signature line on the original filing. "A Mr. J. He." Tae-jun set his coffee cup down. Very carefully. The sound it made against the desk was precise and deliberate, like a period at the end of a sentence that had been building for a long time. James Rhee, Tae-jun said. The paperwork just says J. Rhee. I know which Rhee it is. He stood up slowly, which he did sometimes when the information he was processing needed his whole body to be vertical. He moved around the desk with the controlled fluency of a man who had memorized this room down to the millimeter, and he walked to the window, hand trailing the credenza edge briefly for orientation, and then he stopped, stood with his back to her. James Rhee has been handling my Portland operations for 6 years. Imani looked at the paperwork. Then he's been careful about it, she said. The amounts are small enough individually that they'd fall inside normal variance on a quarterly review. Unless someone is looking specifically. Unless someone is looking specifically, she agreed. Tae-jun turned back toward the room. He didn't look at her, couldn't, but his face was aimed in her direction with that particular precision he used when he wanted to make sure the person he was speaking to understood the full weight of what was being said. You've been here less than a month, he said, 26 days. And you found what 3 accountants and a financial auditor did not. They were reviewing for compliance. I was just reading. There's a difference. What's the difference? Imani considered it. They were looking for what they expected to find wrong. I didn't have any expectations yet. Something moved across Tae-jun's expression. Not quite approval, more like the recognition of a quality he hadn't anticipated needing to assign a category to. He returned to his desk. He picked up his phone. He dialed a number from memory and waited. When the line connected, he said, "Tell Minho I need him, now," and hung up. Minho appeared inside 4 minutes. He came through the side door Imani hadn't known existed until the 3rd week, and he looked between the two of them with the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned to read a room's emotional temperature without letting anyone know he was reading it. Tae-jun said, "James Rhee." Minho's neutrality flickered. Just slightly. Just enough. What about him? He's been moving money through Seagate Pacific, $42,000 over 4 months. A beat. Where did... Minho looked at Imani and then looked back at Tae-jun, and his expression went through something that Imani couldn't fully read, but that felt like a man recalculating several things simultaneously. She found it in the Portland Manifest, Tae-jun said. This morning. Minho said nothing for 2 full seconds. Then, I want to see the paperwork. Imani slid it across to him. He read it standing up, which told her he already knew he wasn't going to like what was in it and didn't want to be seated for that particular experience. His eyes moved quickly and then stopped at the signature line, and she watched his jaw tighten in a way that was very controlled and very involuntary at the same time. J. Rhee, he said. James, Tae-jun confirmed. Minho set the paperwork down. He looked at his hands for a moment, the way people look at their hands, when they are measuring what they're about to say against what they actually feel. James has been with us since 6 years, Tae-jun said. I know. He was at your recovery facility after the explosion. I know that too. He was... Minho stopped. Something in him recalibrated. The personal history visibly compressed itself back behind the professional surface, and when he looked up again, his face was the controlled face, the working face. How do you want to handle it? Quietly. I want to know where the money went before he knows we know. And then? Tae-jun's expression said everything that needed to be said, and it said it without words, which was how he preferred to say the things that couldn't be easily taken back. Minho nodded. He picked up the paperwork. He looked at Imani one more time, and this time the look was different from all the other careful, assessing looks he'd given her. This one contained something that wasn't quite respect, because Minho didn't dispense respect cheaply, but was in the same neighborhood. A kind of professional acknowledgement, the recognition of a useful thing. He left without another word. Imani turned back to her notes. You're not going to ask what happens to him, Tae-jun said. Not my business, Imani said. Most people would ask. Most people aren't trying to hold on to a job they desperately need, she said. And most people probably understand that asking that particular question in this particular office has a specific set of possible answers, and none of them are answers I need to know. Silence. Then, read me the afternoon schedule, She read him the afternoon schedule. The discovery of James Ree's theft did three things to the internal atmosphere of the 42nd floor that Imani could measure in small, observable ways over the following week. The first thing it did was make Minho look at her differently. Not suspiciously, more like a man who has been using a kitchen knife his whole life and has just discovered it's actually a surgical instrument. Careful, recalibrated. She caught him twice watching her work from the doorway of the side entrance, and both times he looked away before she could decide if it was surveillance or something closer to study. The second thing it did was make the men around Tae-jun quieter in a different register than their usual quiet. The usual quiet was deference. This was something older and more animal, the quiet of a group that has just been reminded viscerally that their leader can still find things in the dark. The third thing it did was change the texture of Tae-jun's silence with her. It was harder to explain than the other two. He'd always been sparse with words. Every sentence he used had been edited down to its most functional version before it left his mouth. But there had always been a quality to that efficiency that felt like the management of distance, deliberate space, the maintenance of a professional perimeter that was as precisely calibrated as everything else in his life. After the re-revelation, the perimeter shifted, marginally, in ways she might have missed if she hadn't been paying close attention, which was her problem. She was always paying close attention. He started asking her opinion, not for her observations. He'd done that from the beginning, used her eyes like any other functional tool. He started asking what she thought, about the Portland operations restructuring plan, about whether the quarterly review should be condensed or expanded, about whether the new venue proposal from the hospitality division was worth the risk in the current climate. She answered honestly, every time, including twice when her honest answer was that she didn't know enough about the specific dynamics to have a useful opinion, and those twice she said so directly, rather than performing a confidence she didn't have. Tae-jun seemed to register the honesty of those specific admissions more than the opinions themselves. The morning of the third week of February, Imani arrived to find him standing in front of the credenza in his suit jacket and his shirt, his tie hanging loose and open around his collar, and the particular rigid set of his shoulders that meant something had gone wrong that he hadn't figured out how to solve yet. She recognized the posture. She'd seen it during the revenue calls and once during a shipment delay that had cascaded into a problem that took 3 days to contain. His hands were at the tie ends, not moving, just holding. She stopped inside the door. "I need a minute," he said. She waited. 60 seconds passed. His hands moved through the tie motions twice and produced nothing useful either time, and the rigidity in his shoulders moved upward into his neck, and she watched the frustration of a man who had rebuilt an entire empire from scratch, but could not do this one specific physical thing without a mirror he couldn't use. "Do you want help?" she said. "No." Another 30 seconds. "I'm going to walk toward you," she said. "I'm announcing it." His jaw worked. "I heard what you said." She walked toward him anyway. She didn't hesitate. She didn't move slowly in the cautious way she'd seen other people move around him, the careful way that treated his space like it was fragile, like he was fragile. And that she understood now was the thing that made the temperature in rooms drop when people did it. She walked directly to him, lifted the tie ends, and worked the knot with hands that were steady because she had decided they were going to be steady. He went completely still. Not the predator stillness from her first day. Something different. The stillness of a person who is braced for something that doesn't arrive. She finished the knot, straightened it, smoothed his collar flat with 2 fingers. Stepped back. "You look like you're about to ruin someone's day," she said, "which I assume is the goal." He stood there for a moment without moving. "You didn't ask permission," he said. "I announced myself. That's the rule." The rule is don't enter your space without announcing myself. I announced. You didn't move. That's implicit go-ahead. A pause. That's a very liberal interpretation. "I went to a liberal arts school," Imani said, and went back to her desk. She didn't look at him for the next several minutes, which was deliberate because she understood somehow that he needed those minutes to not be observed. She made notes. She organized the morning's incoming documentation. She let the air in the room return to its normal pressure. He said nothing about it. But at 10:30, when the morning briefing with 3 senior captains ran long and grew fractious over the Portland restructuring, and the largest of the captains, a man named Sung, who had approximately the emotional restraint of a thrown brick, started raising his voice about the decision timeline. Tae-jun held up two fingers and the room went silent, and then said, without any perceptible rise in his own voice, "Imani, the projected revenue differential if we delay the restructuring by 60 days versus implementing immediately." Every head in the room turned toward her. She had the numbers. Of course she had the numbers. She'd spent 40 minutes the previous night making sure she had the numbers, because she was beginning to understand that preparation wasn't optional in this room. Preparation was survival. She gave them the differential. Sung stared at her. Not hostility exactly, more the look of a man who has walked into a room and found a piece of furniture he didn't expect to have opinions. "She's the secretary," Sung said. "She's the person who just answered your question correctly," Tae-jun said. "Sit down." Sung sat down. Imani wrote something in her notepad. She didn't need to write because she needed somewhere to direct her eyes that wasn't at any of the men currently recalibrating their understanding of what she was doing in this room. The captains left at noon. Minho stayed behind, and the two of them, he and Tae-jun, conducted a conversation in low, rapid Korean that lasted 11 minutes while Imani organized the afternoon files and tried not to visibly notice she was being discussed. She spoke no Korean, which she was fairly sure they both knew, but she was good at tone and cadence and the particular rhythm of a disagreement that is being held below the surface of the words, and this conversation had that rhythm. When Minho left, Tae-jun was quiet for a long time. "Sung's going to be a problem," he finally said. "He's already a problem," Imani said. "He just wasn't pointing it at you yet." A pause. "You caught that." "He doesn't like the restructuring because it cuts his access to the Portland routes, and he knows it. He's not worried about the timeline. He's worried about what comes after it." Tae-jun leaned back in his chair. "How long have you known?" 3 days. I was waiting to see if I was reading it wrong." "You weren't." "I know." He almost smiled again. That fractional, barely there thing that arrived too quickly to confirm and left no real evidence. "You're very confident for someone who has worked here a month." "I'm confident about what I know," Imani said. "I'm extremely humble about everything else. Ask me something about maritime law or internal gang hierarchy, and I'll be appropriately useless." This time, there was no question about it. It was brief and small and gone in under 2 seconds, but it was real, and it changed his face entirely, made him look, for that single flash of time, like a man in his mid-30s who was occasionally, against his own will, not miserable. She filed it away without making anything of it. He asked her to stay late that Thursday. Not late the way administrative jobs meant late. An extra hour, maybe 90 minutes. Late the way Tae-jun operated, which meant the city outside had gone dark, and the rain had shifted from sideways to straight down, and Imani had eaten the dinner she'd packed and then half of a second meal she'd ordered through the building's kitchen account because she had learned by week 3 to manage her own logistics without waiting for anyone to manage them for her. They were going through 6 months of Sung's operational reports, which Tae-jun wanted her to cross-reference against 3 other captains' reports from the same period. It was the kind of work that looked like paperwork, but was actually the construction of a case, a slow, careful assembly of evidence that would allow him to act on what he already knew with something more substantial than his own certainty. Imani understood that. She didn't say she understood it. She just did the work. At some point after 10 in the evening, she became aware that Tae-jun's breathing had changed in a way that was subtle enough to almost miss. He was sitting very still with his hands flat on the desk, and his face had taken on an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled expression, not the calculating expression, but something underneath both of those. Something that looked like a man trying to hold something together that was coming apart from the inside. She stayed still, watched, waited. He pressed both hands harder against the desk surface, and his jaw tightened, and she understood suddenly, not from anything she'd been told, but from the specific quality of the stillness, that he was not in this office right now. He was somewhere else, somewhere with fire in it. "Tae-jun," she said. His head moved slightly. "You're in the office. I'm here. It's 10:15 at night and the rain is hitting the windows on the north side. You can hear it if you listen. It changed direction about 20 minutes ago." His breathing was still wrong, shallow, pressured. She stood and walked to the desk without announcing herself this time, because announcement seemed wrong for this particular moment, and she put her hand over his. Not gently, Not the careful, fragile way people touch things they thought might shatter. Firmly, grounded. Feel the desk, she said. Walnut, heavy. It's not going anywhere. His hand turned over under hers and gripped it, hard. The kind of grip that had nothing to do with her specifically, and everything to do with a man finding the only fixed point available in a room that was coming apart. She stayed still. Held on. 30 seconds. 40. The breathing began to slow and regularize, and the grip on her hand loosened by degrees, and the man sitting across the desk from her came back from wherever he'd been in increments that she could feel in the changing pressure of his fingers. When he finally let go of her hand, he turned his face away from her. Not because he couldn't see her, she understood now that the gesture had nothing to do with visual orientation and everything to do with the instinct to hide a face that was doing something he hadn't approved it to do. These episodes happen, he said. His voice was compressed into its most controlled register, which meant it cost him more than usual to produce it. They're a neurological result of the injury. They are not— You don't have to explain it, Imani said. I'm not explaining, I'm clarifying. Okay. She stepped back. I'm going to make you fresh coffee because the last cup has been sitting for 2 hours. The work will be there when you're ready. She went to the credenza, made the coffee, kept her back to him long enough for the room to return to its normal pressure, and when she came back and set the cup exactly where it belonged, to the right of the phone, which she now knew as automatically as she knew her own address, he had straightened in his chair and composed his face into its working configuration, and she sat back down across from him and said, Sung's October report has a weight discrepancy in the northbound container summary. Do you want me to note it or flag it? Flag it, he said, without missing a beat. They worked for another hour. She didn't mention what had happened. He didn't thank her. And again, somehow, that was exactly correct. The evening she found Sung's full parallel accounting, not the careful small discrepancies of the re-operation, but an entire shadow revenue stream running through 4 different shell registrations. Was a Tuesday, and Minho was in the room when she found it, which she was retrospectively grateful for, because the expression on his face when she laid it out confirmed that she wasn't misreading the numbers. She wasn't misreading anything. Sung had not been skimming. Sung had been building. An entire parallel operation funded by redirected waterfront revenue, with connections to a logistics company she didn't recognize but that Minho clearly did, because the name of it made him go very still and look at Tae-jun with an expression that was the most unguarded she'd ever seen from him. Do-hwan, Minho said. Tae-jun didn't move for 3 full seconds. He's been feeding Do-hwan, he said. Not a question. For at least 8 months, Imani said. The payment started 2 months before the Portland route restructuring was even internally proposed, which means he knew the restructuring was coming before I announced it, Tae-jun said. Silence. Real silence. The kind that has weight. There's a second account, Imani said, because stopping now felt wrong, felt like stopping in the middle of surgery because the situation was worse than expected. It's newer, 3 months old. The payments are more frequent and significantly larger, and they don't look like operational transfers. She laid the documents flat on the desk in front of him, then described them in the precise, sequenced way she'd developed over 2 months. Not summarizing, not softening, just reading the numbers in the order that made their meaning impossible to miss. Tae-jun listened to every word. When she finished, the room was so quiet she could hear the rain on the northern windows and the subtle sound of Minho's controlled breathing and nothing else. He's not just feeding Do-hwan operational intelligence, Tae-jun said. No, Imani agreed. He's financing something specific. She nodded, then remembered. Yes. Tae-jun's hands were flat on the desk again. But this time, it wasn't a trauma response. This was something much colder and much more deliberate. The stillness of a man taking careful inventory of exactly what he was about to do. Minho, he said. Yes. Find out what he's financing. Minho left immediately. Imani stayed at her desk and didn't pack her things to go home, even though it was past 11 and her back hurt and she'd been awake since 5:30, because she understood somehow that this particular night had not finished requiring things from her yet. Tae-jun said nothing for a long time. Then, you understand what this means. Sung is connected to your rival. Your rival has been receiving intelligence about your operations for at least 8 months, and the new payment suggests something active is being planned. Yes. And I found it. Yes. She let the weight of that settle for a moment. Which means whoever is planning whatever is being planned is going to figure out eventually that someone found it. Tae-jun's face was completely still. Yes. Imani looked at her notepad, then at the documents on the desk, then at the dark windows. So I'm not anonymous anymore. You haven't been anonymous, he said, since you corrected the waterfront revenue report in your first week. She thought about that. You knew that then. I knew that then. And you didn't… She stopped. You kept using me anyway. I kept using the best tool available to me, he said, and then, after a pause that lasted slightly longer than his pauses usually lasted, and I will not pretend that decision was cost-free for you. It wasn't. I knew that and I made it anyway. The honesty of that hit her differently than she expected, not because she didn't know it already. She wasn't a person who required dishonesty wrapped in comfort, but because Kang Tae-jun did not apologize, did not soften, did not dress it up. He handed her the exact truth of what he'd done and held it there for her to look at. She looked at it. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. Outside, the rain shifted direction again, returning to the sideways assault it had been conducting for 11 consecutive days. Inside the 42nd floor office, the documents on the desk described the shape of a trap that was not yet fully assembled but was getting there, and the two people inside it sat across from each other in the particular darkness Kang Tae-jun had built around himself, and neither of them reached for the door. The next morning, Minho came back with the answer about what Sung's payments were financing. He came back alone, which was unusual, and he closed the side door behind him, which was more unusual, and he looked at both of them with the expression of a man who has spent the night with information he wishes he could put somewhere outside his own head. It's a location, Minho said. Do-hwan's people have been surveilling a target for 3 months. They've been tracking movement patterns, timing a vehicle route, building a tactical picture. He stopped. Tae-jun waited. The location is this building, Minho said. The vehicle route is yours. Imani set down her pen. Tae-jun said nothing. They know your schedule, Minho continued. They know your routes. They know the gaps in security rotation. And they know… He looked at Imani, just for a moment, then back at Tae-jun. They've been watching her too, her routes, her timing. The room was very quiet. They're not just coming for me, Tae-jun said. No, Minho said. They're coming for what you depend on. Imani thought about the parking garage, the rain, the phone call that would come at 2:47 in the morning, 3 weeks from now, and the sound of a woman's controlled breathing on the other end of the line. A woman working very hard not to give anyone the satisfaction of hearing her be afraid. She didn't know that yet, but sitting in the dark of the 42nd floor, with the rain against the windows and the documents laid out in front of her and Minho, looking at her with an expression that was equal parts professional regret and something she could only read as the beginning of genuine fear, she understood something that settled into her chest like cold water finding its level. There was no version of leaving now that put her on the safe side of this. She was already inside it. She had been inside it, she realized, since the morning she'd corrected the waterfront revenue report and felt Kang Tae-jun's attention shift and fix on her like a compass needle finding north. She picked up her pen. Then we need to figure out who else inside this organization has been talking, she said. Because Sung didn't build this by himself, and if Do-hwan knows my roots, someone who isn't Sung has been watching me. Minho stared at her. Tae-jun turned his face toward her with that precise, directional attention. Start with the security rotation, she said. The gaps they know about. Someone had to tell them when the gaps happen. That's not public information. A beat of silence. Then Tae-jun said, very quietly, She's right. And the three of them looked at each other in the dark of a room that had just become considerably more dangerous than it had been the day before. And nobody reached for the door, and nobody suggested she leave. And the rain kept hitting the northern windows, relentless and sideways, and entirely indifferent to the shape of what was coming. The security rotation logs took Imani 4 hours to pull apart. Not because they were hidden. They weren't. Not exactly. They were just stored across 3 separate administrative systems that had been designed, she was increasingly convinced, by someone who wanted them to be technically accessible while being practically invisible to anyone who didn't already know what they were looking for. She knew what she was looking for. She'd been building a picture in her head since the moment Minho said the word routes, and the picture had edges now, and the edges were sharp. She spread the printed logs across the secondary conference table in the corner of the office. Tae-jun had told her, 10 minutes after Minho left, to use whatever space she needed and to treat the room accordingly, which was the closest he came to saying this matters, work without constraint. And she went through them rotation by rotation, week by week, building a timeline of the gaps. Tae-jun sat at his desk and listened to her work. She'd learned that he did that, tracked the rhythm of her movements, the particular sounds of her process, used the acoustic information to follow what she was doing without asking. The shuffle of papers meant she was comparing. The long silences meant she was calculating. The small, sharp exhale that she didn't entirely control meant she'd found something she hadn't wanted to find. She made that sound at the end of the second hour. "Tell me," he said. She looked at the page for another full 10 seconds, because she wanted to be sure, because this was the kind of finding you needed to be sure about before you said it out loud in a room like this one. "The gaps in the security rotation happen on a 13-day cycle," she said. "Not random. 13 days almost exactly, which means they're not operational gaps. They're not happening because of shift conflicts or staffing issues. They're consistent because someone is making them consistent. Who controls the rotation scheduling? Officially, it rotates between 3 senior security coordinators on a monthly cycle." She checked her notes. But the actual input into the scheduling system, the person who physically enters the rotation assignments, that access log shows one primary user for the last 8 months. She stopped. Tae-jun waited. "Minho," she said. The words sat in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Tae-jun did not move. Imani kept her eyes on the log. Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest that she was going to have to deal with later, when she was somewhere private, because right now she needed every available part of herself to be precise. "I'm not saying Minho created the gaps. The scheduling system is his responsibility. He's the one with administrative access. That's not unusual. But the gaps follow a pattern, and the pattern is consistent. And if someone wanted to communicate the rotation schedule to a third party, they would have access to exactly this information." Tae-jun's hands were flat on the desk. There's a second possibility," she said, because she was going to give him everything, not just the bad parts. Someone else could have accessed the system using Minho's credentials. It happens. It's not the more likely explanation, but it's possible. You're giving me an exit. I'm giving you the complete picture." He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she looked up from the logs and looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not the trauma response from late nights, not the controlled fury of the Sung revelation, something older, something that had been sitting in him for years and had just been handed a reason to surface. "Get Minho," he said. "Don't tell him why." She went to the door and relayed the request to Cho in the hallway, who nodded and disappeared toward the stairwell. She came back to the conference table and gathered the logs into a specific order, not hiding them, but organizing them so that the sequence of the conversation had its own structure, its own internal logic. She'd learned that evidence was most effective when it told a story that built the way actual understanding built, one piece at a time. No exits offered until all the doors were already closed. Minho arrived in 6 minutes. He came through the main door this time, not the side entrance, which meant he'd come from elsewhere in the building rather than from his adjacent office. And he looked between Tae-jun and Imani with his standard professional assessment and found nothing in either of their faces that told him anything specific, which was correct, because both of them had agreed, wordlessly, through the particular quality of the silence after she'd said Minho's name, to not telegraph the direction of what was coming. "Close the door," Tae-jun said. Minho closed it. "Sit down." A brief pause. Brief enough to miss if you weren't watching for it, and Imani was watching for it. And then Minho sat in the chair across from Tae-jun's desk. He didn't look at the conference table. He looked at Tae-jun. "The security rotation gaps," Tae-jun said. "Walk me through who has access to the scheduling system." Minho's expression didn't change. "I have primary administrative access. The 3 senior coordinators have read access for their relevant periods." "Why?" "The gaps follow a 13-day pattern," Tae-jun said. "Consistent across 8 months." A beat. "That's not possible. The rotation is generated to avoid pattern consistency. It's specifically designed to... It's not designed well enough, Imani said from the conference table. She kept her voice level. Or it was designed well enough and something changed 8 months ago. Either way, the pattern is there. I can walk you through it. Minho looked at her, then at the logs on the table, then back at Tae-jun. You're saying the schedule was manipulated? I'm saying the schedule has a pattern, Tae-jun said. I'm asking you to explain it. Something moved through Minho's face then. A rapid sequence of things that happened too quickly and too close together to read individually, but that collectively produced a man who had just understood the shape of the conversation he was in. His hands, which had been resting on his knees, pressed slightly into the fabric of his trousers. His chin came up a fraction of an inch. You think I did it, he said. Tae-jun said nothing. You think I've been feeding the rotation to Do-hwan? Still nothing. I've been with you for 9 years, Minho said, and the composure in his voice had something underneath it now. Not guilt, not panic, but something rawer and more human than either of those. Something that sounded like a man who has just been handed an injury he didn't see coming. 9 years. I was there when they pulled you out of the warehouse. I was there for all of it. And you're sitting there letting her build a case against me based on access logs. I'm sitting here asking you to explain a pattern, Tae-jun said. The same way I would ask anyone. The same way you would ask anyone. Minho let out a short, controlled breath. I see. Can you explain it? A pause. Then, someone accessed my credentials. It's the only explanation because I didn't create any pattern, and I have no connection to Do-hwan. And if you believe otherwise, then this conversation is going to go somewhere that neither of us can come back from. Imani looked down at the logs. She looked at the timestamp column she'd been staring at for 4 hours, and she felt the particular sensation of a person who has been building toward one conclusion and has just caught a thread that pulls in a different direction. When did you last change your system password? She said. Minho looked at her. It auto-rotates every 90 days. And between rotations, who else has physical access to your workstation? A pause. My office is locked when I'm not in it. Who has a key? Myself. The building security master. And... He stopped. And, Imani said. Minho's jaw tightened. Sung has a master key for senior operational spaces. It was granted 18 months ago for coordination purposes during the Portland restructuring planning. The room was very quiet. Sung has had access to your office, Tae-jun said. For coordination, Minho said. For legitimate coordination purposes. I was present every time he stopped again. And this time the stop was different. The stop of a man reviewing memory with new information overlaid on it and finding that certain moments look different when the filter changes. He came in twice when I wasn't there. He said he was leaving documentation. I didn't think... He logged into your workstation, Imani said. He didn't need long, 1 session. He set up a remote access protocol and pulled the scheduling credentials. After that, he didn't need physical access anymore. Minho stared at her. She laid it out. Not quickly, not dramatically. She didn't have any interest in performing the revelation. She just walked him through the access log timestamps, the remote session indicators buried in the system records that she'd found in the 3rd hour of her analysis. The specific moments when the scheduling system had been accessed from a device that wasn't registered to any of the 3 senior coordinators. It was Sung's work, and it was careful work, but it wasn't careful enough for someone who was actually looking, and she had been looking. When she finished, Minho was looking at the table. Tae-jun said very quietly, Your name is clean. My name is clean, Minho said. His voice had gone flat in a specific way. The flatness of controlled relief mixed with something much less comfortable. Sung used me, used my access, used the trust I had in a colleague to... He stopped. For 8 months. While sitting in this building, Tae-jun said, while attending operations meetings, while being present for decisions that he was simultaneously feeding to the man who wants me dead. Nobody said anything for a moment. We contained the wrong threat, Minho said finally. We contained a threat, Tae-jun said. We were looking at Ri and Sung, and we missed who was actually directing them. Do-hwan was always directing them. No. Tae-jun's voice shifted. Something in it that Imani hadn't heard before. A specific register of certainty that wasn't anger, wasn't cold fury, was something more fundamental than both. Someone inside this organization has been talking to Do Hwan for longer than 8 months, longer than Sung's involvement. The Portland routes were exposed before the restructuring was internally proposed, which means someone knew about internal strategy discussions before Sung had access. The silence that followed that was different from all the previous silences. It was the silence of a room in which everyone present has just looked at the shape of a problem and realized it is considerably larger than the shape they had been working with. A second source, Minho said. An older one, Tae-jun said. Imani felt something cold and specific move through her. Not fear exactly, but the particular sensation of understanding that the ground you have been standing on has been undermined in ways you cannot yet fully map. She looked at the logs. She looked at the timestamp of Sung's first remote access session, 8 months ago. And then she thought about what Tae-jun had just said, that the Portland routes had been compromised before even that. And she did the mental math that she did not want to do, but that her brain was doing anyway, automatic and relentless. How long has Do Hwan been planning this, she said. It wasn't directed at either of them specifically. Long enough, Tae-jun said, that Sung was not the beginning, he was the escalation. Minho stood up. He stood up with a controlled speed that indicated he had organized himself back into his working configuration through sheer discipline, and he said, I need to go through every operations meeting transcript from the last 14 months, every attendee list, every document that was present. Do it quietly, Tae-jun said. Whoever the second source is, they don't know we know there's a second source. That is the only advantage we have right now, and I need it to last. Minho left. The door closed. Imani sat at the conference table and looked at the logs and thought about the shape of the thing they were inside, and how it was bigger than she'd understood when she walked into that office 26 days ago with damp hair and an overdue rent payment and the specific recklessness of a person with nothing left to lose. She wasn't that person anymore. She had things to lose now. She was not entirely sure how that had happened or when, but she was sure it was true, and the truth of it sat in her chest with a weight that was becoming increasingly difficult to breathe around. Go home, Tae-jun said. She looked up. What? Go home. Sleep. Come back in the morning. There's still everything, he said. There will still be everything tomorrow. You've been reading documents for 4 hours, and you found what 3 professional investigators would have taken 3 weeks to find. Go home. She looked at him. He was sitting with his hands flat on the desk and his face aimed at the middle distance, and there was something in his posture that she was reading without being entirely sure she was reading it correctly. Something that looked like a man who needed the room to himself for reasons that had nothing to do with strategy. She packed her bag. At the door, she stopped. The second source, she said. You already have a candidate. A pause. Yes. You're not going to tell me who? Not tonight. She understood that. She understood it the way she understood all of the things about this situation that she couldn't fix with information. Some things needed to be carried alone for a while before they became shareable. She'd spent enough of her own life knowing that. Okay, she said, and went home. She didn't sleep well. She lay in her apartment with the rain still going sideways against her windows, the Seattle February that had no intention of ending, and she thought about security logs and 13-day patterns and a name that kept appearing in the edges of everything without ever being the center of it. And she thought about Tae-jun sitting in the dark of that office after she'd left, alone with whatever he knew, and she thought about what it meant to be inside something that was getting bigger the more carefully you looked at it. She got up at 4:30 and made coffee and sat at her kitchen table with a notepad and worked through the access timeline from memory, because she did her best thinking when her hands were doing something, and what she found when she worked through it from a fresh angle was not an answer exactly, but a shape. The outline of a question she hadn't asked yet because it hadn't occurred to her to ask it. And the reason it hadn't occurred to her was that it required looking at a piece of information she'd already filed as settled. The route surveillance. Do Hwan's people had been tracking movement patterns, building a tactical picture. Minho had said that they'd been watching her routes. Her routes. She had only been in this job for 26 days. She'd only started taking consistent routes, consistent enough to surveil after the second week when her schedule had settled into enough of a pattern to have routes at all, which meant someone had flagged her as significant within days of her starting. Not weeks. Days. She put down her pen. She thought about Minho's face on the first day, in the hallway, looking at her with that careful assessment. She thought about the junior operative Cho, permanently positioned near the stairwell. She thought about the senior captains at the operations meeting, recalibrating when Tae-jun asked her to answer Sung's question. She thought about who had known, within the first week, that she was going to be something more than a secretary. And she thought about who, inside that building, had a reason to communicate that information to someone outside it. She sat with that for a long time. When she arrived at the Meridian Tower at 7:15, the lobby felt different. She'd learned the lobby's rhythms over the past month, who was usually there, what the security desk posture looked like on a normal morning versus a morning after something had shifted internally. This morning, the guard at the secondary desk, a man she'd nodded to every day for 4 weeks, looked at her with a half-second of something she couldn't name before his expression returned to professional neutral. She kept walking. Tae-jun was at his desk, which was not surprising. What was surprising was that Minho was already there too, seated in the chair across from the desk, and between them was a document that Imani recognized from across the room as an organizational chart. Not the official one, but a hand-drawn version on large paper, with names and connection lines done in a handwriting that was too precise to be anyone's but Minho's. They both heard her come in. Neither of them looked toward the door. Tae-jun couldn't, Minho didn't. And that symmetry had an intentional quality to it, like they had been waiting for her arrival specifically and had agreed beforehand to receive it in this particular way. "Sit down," Tae-jun said. She sat. "We found the second source," Minho said. His voice was completely flat. Not the flatness of neutral professionalism. The flatness of a man who has spent the night building toward a conclusion he found deeply unpleasant and has arrived there and is now functioning in the aftermath of that arrival. He turned the organizational chart around and slid it across to her. She looked at it. The name at the center of the secondary network, connected by Minho's precise lines to Do Hwan's operation, to the route surveillance timeline, to the early intelligence that had preceded even Sung's involvement, was Park Yoon-seok, the financial manager, the man whose jacket she had returned in the elevator in her first week. She looked at the chart for a long moment. "He's been with you how long?" she said. 11 years, Tae-jun said. She thought about the man in the elevator, sweating through his collar. You should be careful, getting noticed in there. She had thought he was warning her about the politics of visibility inside a dangerous organization. She had thought it was the nervous advice of a man who had learned to stay small. He had been warning her because he had already told someone about her. He had flagged her to Do Hwan within days of her starting, possibly within hours. And what she had read as the anxiety of an embarrassed subordinate had been the specific discomfort of a man who had just seen something he needed to report and was calculating how quickly he could get to a phone. "He knew the moment I mattered," she said. "He knew before you knew," Tae-jun said. "How long has he been feeding Do Hwan?" 14 months, Minho said. "Based on the pattern of intelligence gaps, it starts 14 months ago. 2 months before the warehouse incident in the Portland territory. 4 months before Rhee's operation. He's not a follower. He's not someone who was recruited because he was vulnerable or greedy. He has been coordinating." Imani looked at the chart. "Park has been coordinating Rhee and Sung." "From inside the financial division," Minho said, "where he had visibility into every operation, every revenue flow, every strategic decision that passed through the accounting review." "He was in the room for the operations meeting," Imani said, "last week, when you asked me about the revenue differential." She looked at Tae-jun. "He was there." "He was there," Tae-jun confirmed. "He watched you ask me a question in front of the senior captains. He watched the captains recalibrate around me." She worked through the implications of that. He knew immediately what that meant for Do Hwan's timeline. If I'm visible as a strategic asset, Do Hwan's window for the ambush closes, because you'll change the routes, reinforce the security, change the pattern. Park had to communicate that to Do Hwan that same afternoon. "We believe he did," Minho said, "which means Do Hwan moved his timeline up." "Which means," Tae-jun said very quietly, "that whatever Do Hwan has been planning for 14 months is no longer in preparation." The words landed in the room and sat there. Imani felt the cold sensation again, the ground being undermined feeling. But this time it was accompanied by something that was not quite fear and not quite anger, and sat somewhere between the two in her chest with a sharpness that she recognized as the physical sensation of understanding arriving faster than she wanted it to. "He's ready," she said. "He's been ready," Minho said. "We just told him his window was closing." The door opened, not Cho from the stairwell, not any of the regular operational personnel. The man who came through the main door was someone Imani had seen twice in the building's lower lobby, but never on the 42nd floor. Late 50s, former military posture, the particular stillness of someone who delivered specific categories of information for a living. He looked at Tae-jun and said, "Park Yun-seok is not in the building." Silence. "He came through the lobby at 6:50, the man continued. "He went through security. He badged into the 41st floor at 6:53. He has not badged out, but he's not in the building." Minho stood up. "He knows we know," Tae-jun said. "The 41st floor has a secondary stairwell exit that bypasses the main lobby badge system," the security man said. "It was installed during the renovation 3 years ago. It's logged, but not actively monitored." "He knew about the exit," Minho said. "Of course he knew about the exit. He's been in this building for 11 years. "He made a call before he left," the security man said. He looked specifically at Tae-jun when he said the next part. "We've been monitoring his communications since 0400 per Mr. Kwan's instructions. The call lasted 45 seconds. We have the record, but not the content. It was encrypted." "To Do-hwan," Tae-jun said. "Almost certainly." The room was completely still. Imani looked at Tae-jun. She looked at the organizational chart on the table, with Park's name at the center of it, and at the connection lines drawn in Minho's precise handwriting, running outward to every weak point in the organization they had been trying to identify and shore up. And she understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that the chart was wrong, not inaccurate, wrong in a larger sense. "This isn't the network," she said. Both of them looked toward her. "This is the network we found," she said. "Rishi, Sung, Park, the scheduling gaps, the route surveillance, the shell accounts. We've been following a structure that was designed to be followed. We found exactly what someone wanted us to find, in exactly the sequence that maximized how long it took us to find it." She looked at Minho. "Ri was the first one I found. The waterfront manifest, that was my first week. It practically walked me to it." A pause. "You're saying Ri was a flag," Minho said. "I'm saying someone who has been inside this organization for 11 years and has been planning for 14 months is not going to leave $42,000 in a manifest by accident." She looked at Tae-jun. "P was meant to be found. Sung was meant to be found. Park was meant to be found. Not easily. Not so easily it looked planted. But found. In sequence. In a progression that kept us looking inward. While Do-hwan moved on the outside," Tae-jun said. "While Do-hwan positioned everything he needed. And when Park made his call this morning, he told Do-hwan we'd reached the end of the internal trail," Minho said. His voice had gone to a register she hadn't heard from him before. "He told him we were about to stop looking inside and start looking outside. He told him the window was—" Tae-jun's phone rang. Not his personal phone. The office landline, which Imani had heard ring exactly 3 times in 2 months, and each time the room had gone quiet around it in a specific way. It rang twice. Tae-jun picked it up. He listened. Imani watched his face go through something. Not the controlled professional surface, not the trauma response stillness, but a third thing she had never seen before, a thing that lived deeper than either of those. The face of a man receiving information that strikes something structural. He set the phone down. "Minho," he said. His voice was exactly level. "How many of our vehicles are currently in secured locations?" Minho checked his phone. "The armored fleet is in the sub-basement, 3 vehicles. The secondary vehicles are in the—" He stopped. He was reading something on his screen that was arriving in real time. His face changed. "The secondary lot, east side." "How many?" "There were 4. Minho's jaw locked. "There are 2. 2 vehicles are missing from a secured operational lot," Tae-jun said. "Removed in the last 40 minutes, Minho said. Before we issued the alert. Someone with lot access." "Someone Park told Do-hwan about," Imani said. "Someone else. Still inside." She looked at Tae-jun. "There's a third source." The room went absolutely silent, and then Tae-jun said something she had not heard from him in 2 months of watching him navigate betrayal and revelation and the methodical dismantling of everything he thought he understood about the people around him. He said, "I need everyone out of this building except the three of us. Now." Minho looked at him. "If we pull personnel, the building goes effectively dark. We lose our defensive. We've already lost our defensive position," Tae-jun said. "We lost it when Park walked out through a stairwell exit and made a 45-second phone call. This building is not safe. It has not been safe since 6:50 this morning, and every person still in it is leverage." He stood up from behind the desk. It was the movement of a man who has arrived at a decision that cannot be unmade, and Imani felt the shift in the room's gravity that accompanied it, the particular quality of a moment where everything that comes after will be shaped by what is decided right now. "Do-hwan is not coming to negotiate," Tae-jun said. "He built 14 months of preparation for one specific objective. He used 3 sources inside my own organization. He timed Park's exit to coincide with the removal of vehicles from the secondary lot. This is not the beginning of his operation." He turned his face toward Imani, that precise, directional attention. "This is the execution, waterfront, in an abandoned refrigerated processing plant with long corridors and steel chambers and almost no natural light." Seo Do-hwan looked at his phone and read Park's message, and he set the phone down on a metal table. And he told the men around him that it was time, and the cold fluorescent lights of the processing plant hummed above them all as the final phase of 14 months of planning began to move like a machine that had been wound too tight for too long and had finally been released. And outside, the February rain continued its assault on every window in the city, indifferent as always to the shape of what was coming. The evacuation of the Meridian Tower took 19 minutes. Not because it was slow. Minho ran it with the compressed efficiency of a man who had planned for exactly this category of emergency and was now discovering that planning and execution occupied entirely different registers of the nervous system. It was 19 minutes because the building had 42 floors and a workforce that had to be moved without causing the kind of visible disruption that would communicate to anyone watching from the outside that the interior architecture of Kang Tae-jun's organization had just been surgically compromised from within. Imani watched it happen from the 42nd floor window, the one with the blackout curtain pulled partially aside, the one that showed her a narrow vertical strip of Seattle's gray February morning. People leaving in ones and twos, different exits, different timing, the specific choreography of an organization that had practiced disappearing. Behind her, Tae-jun was on the phone. He had been on the phone for 11 of those 19 minutes, conducting 3 conversations in a sequenced overlap that she could only partially follow. One in Korean, one in English, one that switched between both mid-sentence in a way that suggested the other party was doing the same. His voice stayed level throughout. Not calm exactly. Level. There was a difference. Calm was the absence of pressure. Level was pressure being managed with both hands and not showing the effort. She watched the street below and counted exits and thought about the 2 missing vehicles from the secondary lot and what a man like Do-hwan would do with 2 operational vehicles he had taken from a secured location 40 minutes before his plan went into execution phase. He would position them. She didn't say that out loud. Tae-jun was already thinking it. She could tell by the particular way he paused between the end of one phone conversation and the beginning of the next. A fraction of a second longer than usual, the pause of a man running parallel calculations. He ended the last call. "The secondary lot vehicles," he said. "Already thinking about it," she said. "Where?" "If I wanted to control your movement out of this building, I'd want coverage on the primary exit and the service exit. The sub-basement garage has 1 vehicle egress point. If I had 2 vehicles, I'd put one on the street level above the garage ramp and one on the eastern service road." Tae-jun turned toward Minho, who had come back through the side door. "The sub-basement. It's the only secured egress we have left," Minho said. "The street-level vehicles are all potentially exposed." "He'll have the garage ramp covered," Imani said. Both of them looked toward her. "It's what I would do," she said. "He has 2 vehicles he took quietly. He doesn't want a confrontation at the tower. Too public, too many variables. He wants to control where the confrontation happens. He'll let us leave. He'll follow. He'll choose the location." Minho looked at Tae-jun. "She's right. If he wanted to move on the building, he would have moved already." "He wants the industrial district," Tae-jun said. Not a guess. Something else. Recognition. "The processing plant. He's had it prepared. He told us as much by choosing it as the location for Imani. Imani went still. The processing plant. Long corridors. Steel chambers. Almost no natural light. He wants to fight you on his ground, she said. He wants to fight me on ground he believes is his advantage, Tae-jun said. Controlled environment, low light, complex spatial layout. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not a smile. The shadow of one, with something cold underneath it. He's been planning this for 14 months, and he still thinks darkness is something that works against me. It doesn't, Imani said. Not anymore. Minho looked between them. You're going to go. He has Imani as leverage, Tae-jun said. No. He will have Imani as leverage. That's the structure of the call that's coming. That's been the structure of this entire operation. Get her away from me. Use her to bring me to a location I can't navigate, and end it there. He's been working toward this specific sequence for weeks. Then we don't follow the sequence, Minho said. We follow it exactly, Tae-jun said. Because inside the sequence, there's a moment he hasn't accounted for. The phone rang. The personal phone. The one that almost never rang. All three of them knew what it was before Tae-jun picked it up. He listened. He said nothing for 30 seconds. He set the phone down. They took her from the parking structure, he said. 40 minutes ago. She went to retrieve something from her car before the evacuation. Nobody tracked her exit from the building. Imani felt the bottom drop out of something in her chest. Then she caught herself. She was here. She was standing in this office. The person they'd taken from the parking structure was someone else. Someone who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, inside an operation that had more moving parts than any of them had fully mapped. Who? Minho said. Soo Yeon, Tae-jun said. The front desk coordinator. Minho's expression did something involuntary. He controlled it quickly. She has everything to do with it now, Tae-jun said. Do-hwan doesn't need leverage that's operationally significant. He needs something that creates urgency, something that makes the timeline non-negotiable. He paused. He'll make contact in the next 20 minutes. He'll give me the location. He'll give me a window. And the window will be short enough that I can't build a meaningful response team. You're not going alone, Minho said. I'm going with what Do-hwan expects me to bring. Tae-jun turned his face toward Imani. That directional precision. Which means I'm going with her. Imani looked at him. He expects you to bring me, she said. It wasn't a question. You're the asset he's been building toward. He wants to demonstrate, to whatever audience he imagines is watching, that he found the blind tiger's weakness and exploited it completely. Taking Soo Yeon is a mechanism. What he actually wants is you there when he ends this. As a witness, she said. As evidence, Tae-jun said, that he found the thing I couldn't function without and removed it. She processed that. She thought about what it meant to be the thing someone used as evidence of another person's weakness. To be weaponized not through your own vulnerability, but through someone else's need for you. She thought about Soo Yeon in a cold building somewhere near the waterfront, frightened and completely uninvolved, and caught inside a machine that had been running for 14 months and didn't care about collateral. Okay, she said. Minho stared at her some. Okay. I'm going, she said. That was never actually a question. She looked at Tae-jun. What do I need to know about the building? Tae-jun was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, Tell me what you know about navigating in the dark. The call came 17 minutes later. Do-hwan's voice on the line was exactly as Tae-jun had described it once. Not loud, not theatrical, with the specific quality of a man who had been patient for a very long time and found the patience entirely comfortable. He gave the address. He gave the window 90 minutes. He told Tae-jun to come without vehicles and to approach the Eastern Service entrance on foot, because if he detected a convoy, Soo Yeon's situation would become irreversible within 60 seconds of his making that call. He hung up before Tae-jun could respond, just as he always did. The three of them stood in the 42nd floor office for 30 seconds of silence that was entirely occupied by calculation. Minho, Tae-jun said, the power grid. Do you still have the contact? Yes. I need a window of 4 minutes, beginning the moment we're inside the eastern entrance. Can you do it remotely? Minho looked at him for a moment. The entire processing plant grid? The entire block. 4 minutes, Minho said. Yes. I need the signal. I'll give you the signal when we're in position. Tae-jun picked up his jacket. And Minho. Yes. Take the 3 men you trust most. Not most loyal. Most quiet. Position them at the western egress of the plant. Not to enter. Not unless they hear nothing at all for more than 12 minutes after the grid goes down. 12 minutes. Not 11. Minho nodded. He started to leave. Minho. Tae-jun's voice stopped him at the door. Not loud, just precise. The 9 years. I know. A pause. Something moved across Minho's face that was private enough that Imani looked away from it on instinct. Then he left, and the door closed, and Tae-jun and Imani were alone in the office for what she understood might be the last time it looked exactly like this. She picked up her bag, then put it down. There was nothing in it she needed for where they were going. Walk me through it, she said. How you navigate in the dark. What you need from me. He told her. He talked for 8 minutes without stopping, and she listened with the full-body attention she'd brought to everything in this office for 2 months. And she asked 3 questions at precise intervals. And by the end of it, she understood the system. Not perfectly, not the way he understood it, but well enough to execute her part of it. Well enough to be useful instead of being a liability. That was what she needed. The walk to the processing plant took 22 minutes through streets that were wet and gray and occupied only by the specific density of a Seattle February morning that had decided visibility was optional. They went on foot, as Do-hwan had specified. Tae-jun walked beside her with his hand briefly on her arm at the first intersection. Orientation, not dependence. And then they found their rhythm, which was the rhythm they'd built over 2 months without ever naming it. And they moved through the industrial district in the particular silence of 2 people who have run out of things they need to say before a thing happens. She told him when they reached the Eastern Service entrance. A metal door, partially rusted at the hinges. The kind of door that announced itself when it moved. She tested it first, slow, and it gave them 3 inches of movement before the hinge started to complain, and she held it there and they went through sideways, one at a time, and the hinge stayed quiet enough. Inside, the smell was the first thing. Industrial cold, old refrigerant, the specific mineral quality of a building that had been sealed and reopened and sealed again over years of intermittent use. The floor was concrete, wet in patches from ceiling leaks that the February rain had found its way through. The light was exactly what they'd been told to expect. Fluorescent overhead strips, widely spaced, creating pools of flat illumination separated by sections of genuine darkness. She touched his arm twice, the signal they'd agreed on. 2 means step, 1 means stop. He nodded once. She put her mouth close to his ear. Long corridor ahead, maybe 40 meters, 3 light sources. The third one is out. That section is dark. There are 2 people at the far end. Stationary. They're watching the corridor entrance, but they haven't seen us yet. He listened. Then he moved. Not directly down the corridor. He angled left toward the wall, and she understood. The wall gave him a continuous tactile reference without requiring her input for every step. She moved beside him, close enough to touch without touching, and they went down the dark section between the second and third light sources in a quiet that was profound enough that she could hear the fluorescent strips buzzing 40 meters away. They were 12 meters from the 2 men when a third figure appeared from a side door that neither of them had mapped from outside. The figure stopped, looked directly at them. She grabbed Tae-jun's sleeve. He felt it, felt the specific tension in her grip that they hadn't discussed but that translated anyway. And he dropped below the figure's sightline behind a steel support column before the figure's hand could reach whatever it was reaching for. She did the same. Her heart was doing something loud and persistent that she needed to stop focusing on. The figure stood still for 3 seconds, looked into the darkness where they weren't anymore, moved toward the 2 stationary men at the corridor's end and said something in a low voice that she couldn't fully hear, but that had the cadence of a routine check-in. She let out a breath that she didn't let make any sound. Tae-jun's hand found her wrist in the dark. Pulse check. She'd learned that. His fingers rested there for 3 seconds. She felt him registering her heart rate, taking the information the way he took all information, processing it into a tactical picture. And then the hand released. They moved again. The side corridor that opened off the main passage gave them a different route toward the building's center. Longer, through spaces that had been refrigerated storage units, the floor uneven in ways that required slower movement and more communication. She kept her voice at his ear, constant and low, feeding him the picture she could see and he couldn't, the equipment, the distances, the positions of light sources. The two additional men she spotted through a gap in the rusted partition panels before they spotted anything. He listened. He navigated. It was the system they'd built in the office over 2 months. Her eyes, his spatial memory, his capacity to translate information into movement with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for someone working without sight. And inside this building, in this specific context, it was something more than the sum of its parts. She understood something then, moving through the cold dark of the processing plant with Kang Tae-jun, 3 inches to her left, and 14 months of someone else's planning pressing in from every direction. He hadn't just survived losing his sight. He had built an entirely different relationship with the world than the one he'd had before. A relationship based on sound and proximity and the specific intelligence of people who were willing to be present and precise. And that relationship was, in this building, on this particular night, a weapon. Do-hwan didn't know that. Do-hwan thought he had brought a blind man into a dark place. What he had actually done was bring a man into the dark man's home. They found Soo-yeon in the 3rd refrigerated chamber from the building's center. A small room with a heavy door that had been left open 6 inches, a single fluorescent strip still functioning, and Soo-yeon herself sitting with her back against the far wall, her wrists bound with zip ties, her face showing the specific pale composure of a person who has cycled through every version of fear and arrived at something quieter on the other side. She looked up when Imani appeared in the doorway. The relief on her face lasted 3 seconds before she controlled it. "Are you hurt?" Imani said. "No." Her voice was steady. "There are 9 of them. I counted. 7 in the main sections and 2 with the man in the center room. The center room is where—" "I know," Imani said. She worked the zip ties with the small blade Minho had put in her jacket pocket before they left the tower. Not a weapon, he'd said, just a tool, which she had taken to mean that he'd thought about every category of things she might need and tried to provide for it without making her feel like she was being sent to a war she hadn't signed up for. The zip ties came free. Soo-yeon stood up. Her legs were unsteady for a moment and then steadied. She looked at Tae-jun in the doorway with an expression that contained several things simultaneously: gratitude, fear, and something that looked like a person recalibrating everything they thought they knew about the man they'd been working adjacent to for 3 years. "Can you move?" Tae-jun said. "Yes." "There's a western egress. Imani will walk you out. You will not stop for any reason." "What about—" "Imani will walk you out," he said again, and the specific quality of his voice when he said it the second time closed off any available response. Imani looked at him. He turned his face toward her. That directional precision. And she understood that this was the moment where the plan divided into its 2 components. And she understood what her component was. And she understood that he knew she wasn't going to like it. "No," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm not—" "You're taking her out." His voice was completely level. "That is what you're doing. The moment you clear the western egress, Minho gets the signal and the grid goes down. 4 minutes. That's what I need." "And what are you doing for 4 minutes in a dark building with 9 of Do-hwan's people?" "Fewer than 9, he said. "We passed 3 of them on the way in." She looked at him. "You counted," she said. "I listened." The corner of his mouth. "Go." She stood there for 1 more second. There were things she wanted to say, things she had been not saying for 2 months in the particular way that things accumulate in the space between people who are very careful with their words. And the timing was catastrophically wrong for all of them, which was, she was beginning to understand, the specific shape of how important things worked in her life. She put her hand on his arm, not to take his pulse, just to put her hand there. He covered it with his for exactly 3 seconds. Then she took Soo-yeon's arm and they moved. The route out was faster than the route in because she knew it now. She had the map in her head, the positions of the light sources, the wet patches on the floor, the rusted side door, and its 3-inch silence threshold. She moved Soo-yeon through it quickly and quietly, and Soo-yeon moved with the specific compliance of a person who has understood that this is not the moment for questions. They hit the Eastern Service entrance. She pushed through and they were outside in the February rain, and Imani took out the secondary phone Minho had given her and pressed the single contact he'd programmed into it, and when he picked up, she said one word. Now. She felt it more than she heard it, a deep, systemic click somewhere in the building behind them, the sound of a power grid releasing, and then silence where the fluorescent buzz had been. She stood in the rain outside the eastern door and counted. 1. She thought about the man inside the building moving through absolute darkness with the specific intelligence of someone who had spent 3 years learning a world that everyone else had never considered. 12. She thought about 9 men, fewer than 9, discovering that the environment they had designed as a trap had just become someone else's territory. 25. She thought about Do-hwan in the center room, in the dark, waiting for a confrontation he had planned for 14 months and not yet understanding what was moving toward him. Inside the processing plant, in a darkness so complete it had weight, Kang Tae-jun moved. He didn't rush. Rushing was noise. Rushing was disruption in the acoustic picture that was, right now, the only picture available to him and the most detailed picture in the building. He could hear the 7 remaining men, 6 now, 5 seconds ago, 5 now, adjusting to a darkness they had no relationship with, and their adjustment was loud in the way that all fear is loud to someone listening for it. A boot scraping against wet concrete, a hand slapping a wall, searching for an orientation point. 2 men whispering to each other 18 meters to his left. Not words, just the texture of panic beginning to organize itself into something communicable. He moved between them. Not a confrontation, a displacement. He had learned, 3 years of learning, that darkness was not a blunt instrument. It was a precision tool. You didn't fight in it. You used it the way a river uses a channel, following the path that already existed, applying force exactly where it would carry farthest. By the time 2 of Do-hwan's men found each other in the dark and grabbed at each other in mutual alarm, Tae-jun was already past them, moving toward the sound that had been consistent through everything. The measured, controlled breathing of a man in the center room who was not panicking because he had planned for contingencies and believed in his own preparation. Do-hwan was still at the center room. He hadn't moved. That told Tae-jun something. A man who runs when the lights go out is a man who wasn't sure of his position. A man who stays is a man who believes he has something the darkness can't take away. The center room door was open, not 6 inches, fully open. An invitation, a statement. Tae-jun stood in the doorway and listened. One person, stationary, breathing at a rate that suggested control but not ease, a rate that told him the control was costing something. "I know you're there," Do-hwan said. His Korean was clean and soul-accented, which told Tae-jun something about his background that wasn't relevant right now. "I know," Tae-jun said. "The lights don't change anything." "They change everything," Tae-jun said. "You built a trap for a blind man. You didn't account for the possibility that blind men are better at this than you." A pause. "You don't have a weapon." "I don't need one yet." He heard Do-hwan's weight shift, a fractional sound, the specific creak of a man redistributing himself, the almost silent exhale of a man deciding something. Tae-jun tracked it. He had been tracking it since the doorway. He had the spatial picture of the room from the acoustic information and from Imani's intelligence during their approach. Approximately 8 meters by 6, metal shelving along 2 walls, a central table, the second man somewhere to the right who had been described as stationary, and who was, Tae-jun confirmed by ear, still stationary but no longer calm. "The woman is gone," Do-hwan said. "Yes." "Your people will have the egress points by now." "The western ones," Tae-jun said. "You can leave through the eastern entrance. I'm not here to take your people. I'm here for one specific conversation." "You're here because I gave you no choice." "You gave me a choice," Tae-jun said. "Come alone or watch someone die." "I came." The choice part ended there. "Everything that happens in this room is mine." Do-hwan's breathing changed. It was a small change, the kind that a person without 3 years of listening as their primary sense would have missed entirely. A slight quickening, not fear. Recalibration. The sound of a man who had built a version of this conversation in his head for 14 months and was discovering that the actual version was diverging from the planned one in ways he didn't know how to correct for. "Wait, you've been very patient," Tae-jun said. 14 months. He Sung Park. 3 sources, Carefully sequenced, designed to keep me looking inward while you positioned outward. That's not impulsive work. That's a specific kind of intelligence. I'm glad you appreciated it. I appreciate it enough to want to understand one thing. Tae-jun took 2 steps into the room. He tracked the second man's reaction, a subtle shift in weight, a hand movement that sounded like reaching, and he spoke directly to that position without turning his head toward it. Don't. This conversation doesn't include you. Silence. The hand movement stopped. What do you want to understand? Do-hwan said. The woman you took from my building, Tae-jun said. Su Yeon, the front desk coordinator. She has no operational role. She has no intelligence value. You took her specifically because she was there and available, and because her absence would force urgency. He paused. Which means you needed urgency. Which means your timeline had a constraint you didn't plan for. A beat. The Seattle Harbor Authority, Tae-jun said. The new inspection protocol. It goes into effect in 11 days. Everything that moves through the waterfront routes gets documented to a standard that makes the current operation structure untenable. You knew that. You've known it for months. And you built your entire 14-month operation around a window that was always this small. The room was very quiet. You weren't just trying to take my network, Tae-jun said. You were trying to take it before it becomes worthless. The window closes in 11 days. If you don't own the routes by then, nobody does. A long silence. Then Do-hwan said very quietly, You have very good intelligence. I have a very good analyst, Tae-jun said, which is what this entire situation has been about from the beginning. You recognized what she was the moment Park told you about her. You understood that I had found someone who could read the operation the way I couldn't read it myself. And instead of cutting off one source, you accelerated everything because you knew the longer she worked in my organization, the harder it would be to move against me. She was the variable, Do-hwan said. She was the variable, Tae-jun agreed. And you moved her. And here we are. The second man in the room made a decision. Tae-jun heard it before it happened. The specific shift from held stillness to committed movement. The sound of a man who has been waiting for an opening and has decided this particular silence is the closest he's going to get. He heard the direction, the speed, the specific acoustic signature of the man's build moving through air. And he moved in the only direction that made sense given all of that, which was the direction the man wasn't accounting for. And the collision that resulted was not between the two of them, but between the second man and the metal shelving that Tae-jun had stepped away from. And that was, in the dark, exactly where the second man's momentum was carrying him. The sound of the impact was significant. The second man went down and stayed down. Do-hwan said nothing. The room returned to its waiting quality. Here's what happens now, Tae-jun said. His voice had not changed, register through any of the preceding 30 seconds. The waterfront routes are mine. They were mine before the Harbor Authority protocol, and they'll restructure to be mine afterward. Your network in Seattle has no operational future with or without this conversation, because the infrastructure you were trying to take doesn't exist in a form you can use after 11 days. Then why are you here? Do-hwan said. If it's already over. Because I want you to understand something clearly enough that I don't have to have this conversation again. Tae-jun moved toward the sound of Do-hwan's voice. Not rushed, not aggressive. The measured movement of a man who has already decided how this ends and is simply closing the distance to the ending. You spent 14 months building a network inside my organization. You found 3 sources. You timed an operation to a regulatory window. You designed a trap for a blind man in a dark building. He stopped. Close enough now that the other man's breathing was the loudest thing in the room. All of that work, all of that patience, and the thing that undid it was a woman who looked at a shipping manifest in her first week and noticed $42,000 where it shouldn't be. Do-hwan said nothing. Not my soldiers, Tae-jun said. Not my security system. Not my intelligence network. A woman who was desperate enough to take a job nobody else wanted and careful enough to actually read what was put in front of her. He paused. Remember that. Whatever you decide to do after tonight, remember that. Because it will happen again. And it will happen faster. Outside the processing plant, in the rain, Imani was counting. She had counted to 240 and then lost track and started counting from 0 again. And she was at 118 when she heard it. Not an explosion. Not the kind of violent sound she'd been braced for. Something quieter. The sound of something structural, something organizational, something that had been holding a specific shape for 14 months, releasing that shape all at once. She stood in the rain. She counted. At 147, footsteps came from the Eastern Service entrance. More than one set, uneven in cadence. The footsteps of men who had made a decision about continuing something and arrived at a different conclusion than the one they'd started with. Do Hwan's men, 6 of them. Moving past her without looking at her, which was a specific choice and a communicative one. The choice of men who understood that the rules of the current situation required them to leave in a particular direction without acknowledging anything they had seen. She let them go. At 173, the single set of footsteps she had been waiting for came through the eastern entrance. Tae-jun emerged from the doorway and into the rain. He was unhurt. She could tell before she reached him. The quality of his movement, the specific uprightness of his posture, the absence of the particular compensations you make when something structural has been damaged. He stopped when he heard her moving toward him, and he turned his face toward her sound, and she reached him and put her hands on both sides of his face the way she'd wanted to do for longer than she was prepared to calculate, checking, just checking, the way he'd taught her to check, the way you do when the information matters more than anything else. "I'm fine," he said. "I can see that." She didn't take her hands away. "What happened to Do Hwan?" "He left," Tae-jun said. "He'll leave Seattle. He doesn't have a viable operation here, and he has enough intelligence to recognize an unwinnable position. You let him go." "Killing him creates a vacancy," Tae-jun said. "Vacancies in his specific line of work fill quickly and unpredictably. This way he's a known quantity who has been definitively beaten and knows it. That's more useful alive than the alternative." She looked at him. "That's cold," she said. "Yes," he said. "Is it true?" A pause. "Mostly," he said. "The other part is that I didn't need to." The rain came down around them, and the processing plant stood dark and silent behind them, and somewhere on the western side of the building, Minho's 3 men were positioned and waiting, and Imani stood in the February rain with her hand still on Kang Tae-jun's face, and felt something in her chest that had been compressed for 2 months begin, very slowly, to decompress. "The grid," she said. 4 minutes. 3 minutes and 51 seconds, he said. "You counted." "I always count." He reached up and found her wrists, both of them, his hands wrapping around them with the same grounded pressure he'd used on her hand during the episode in the office, the same gravity. "You went out the eastern entrance. I came back. You were supposed to—" "I know what I was supposed to do," Imani said. "I did the part that involved getting Soo-yeon out, and then I came back and stood in the rain and counted, because the alternative was going home, and I wasn't doing that." He was quiet for a moment. His thumbs moved along her wrists. "You're going to tell me," she said, "that this is the part where you say you're glad I'm safe, and we agree that I should have stayed on the other side of the egress point." "Yes," he said. "Are you actually glad?" A pause longer than his usual pauses. "I'm always going to be glad you stayed," he said, and the way he said it had nothing to do with tonight specifically, and everything to do with 26 days and a hiring decision and a tie knot and $42,000 in a shipping manifest and 2 people sitting in a dark office working through the shape of something neither of them had planned for. The rain kept falling. The February dark wrapped around the industrial district and the processing plant and the waterfront with its routes and its regulatory window and its 11 days of remaining leverage, and Kang Tae-jun stood in it with his hands on Imani Whitaker's wrists and his face turned toward the sound of her breathing, and neither of them moved toward the car that Minho had waiting 2 blocks east, because there was a moment happening that they were both unwilling to cut short for the practical requirements of leaving, and the moment was this. 2 people who had survived a machine that had been built to destroy them, standing in the rain, finding out what was left. What was left was considerable. What was left, Imani thought, was going to require some conversation she wasn't yet sure she had the right words for. But she had time. They both did. The machine had run out. The car Minho had waiting was a black sedan, unremarkable, parked 2 blocks east of the processing plant on a street that the February rain had emptied of everything except a single delivery truck, idling outside a warehouse that had no business being open at this hour. Minho was driving. He said nothing when they got in. Tae-jun, in the back. Imani beside him, both of them wet through in the specific way that Seattle rain achieves when you've been standing in it long enough for it to stop being weather and start being a condition. Minho looked at them once in the rearview mirror, assessed whatever he needed to assess, and pulled away from the curb with the controlled smoothness of a man who had been driving people away from situations like this one for 9 years, and understood that the first few minutes after belonged to something other than conversation. The city moved past the windows. Imani watched it. The wet streets, the streetlights bleeding their orange into the puddles. The occasional pedestrian hunched under an umbrella, navigating the particular misery of a Seattle Tuesday at 11:40 in the morning. Ordinary. Completely ordinary. The city had no idea what had just happened in a dark refrigerated building 2 blocks behind them, and it didn't need to. And that normalcy was somehow both the most comforting and the most disorienting thing she had experienced in recent memory. Beside her, Tae-jun sat with his hands in his lap and his head slightly tilted, listening to the city, she understood, reading it through sound the way she was reading it through sight. "So Yeon," he said. "Minho's people took her to the medical facility on 4th, Minho said. "She's unharmed. She'll be there until we can confirm the building is clean." "She goes home tomorrow," Tae-jun said. "Full pay for 2 weeks. And she gets the option to transfer to the administrative office in Portland if she wants distance from the 42nd floor." "She won't want distance," Minho said. "Offer it anyway." Silence for a moment. "Park," Tae-jun said. Minho's hands on the wheel shifted very slightly. "We know where he is." "Leave him." A pause. "He spent 11 years. "I know what he spent," Tae-jun said. "Leave him. He ran because he believed running was still possible. Let him find out it isn't." He paused. "Do-hwan's network in this city is finished. Without the waterfront routes and without the harbor authority window, there's nothing to sell and nobody to sell it to. Park is carrying intelligence that expires in 11 days. After that, he's just a man who burned 11 years of his own life for a network that doesn't exist." Minho said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's a specific kind of punishment." "Yes," Tae-jun said. They drove. The Meridian Tower appeared through the rain like the rest of the city. Ordinary, glass-fronted, indifferent to what had been decided in its name over the past 14 hours. Minho pulled into the sub-basement garage and cut the engine, and the 3 of them sat in the car for a moment in the specific silence of people who have been running at maximum operational intensity for too long and have only just been given permission to stop. Imani became aware, in the stopped car, of how tired she was. Not sleepy. The other kind of tired, the kind that lives in the muscles and the jaw and behind the eyes, the kind that arrives when your body has been managing chemicals it wasn't designed to sustain for extended periods, and has now received the signal that the emergency is over and is releasing all of that in a wave that she felt start somewhere in her lower back and move upward. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. Tae-jun turned his head toward her. "You're crashing," he said. "I'm fine. You've been running on adrenaline since 7 this morning. It's almost noon." He paused. "So have I. The difference is I'm used to it." "You're not used to it," she said. "You've just had more practice pretending you are." A beat. "Yes," he said. "That's accurate." Minho got out of the car and gave them the particular privacy of a man who has understood something about 2 people without being told, and has decided to express that understanding through the dignified mechanism of needing to make a phone call elsewhere. The garage was quiet. The sound of the rain was muffled down here, present but distant, the city's weather reduced to a vague percussion against the concrete above them. Imani looked at the back of the driver's headrest and thought about what came next. Not tactically. She was done with tactical for at least the next several hours. She thought about what came next for her specifically. Her apartment, her kitchen table, the notepad with 2 months of observations on it, the job that had started as 11 days of grocery money and had become something that she didn't have a clean category for. "I need to ask you something," she said. Tae-jun waited. "When Park flagged me to Do-hwan, in the first week." She turned her head to look at him, even though looking at him was an asymmetrical act. She could do it, and he couldn't, and she'd spent 2 months navigating that asymmetry with as much care as she could manage, which sometimes meant looking and sometimes meant deliberately not looking, depending on what the moment required. Right now, she needed to look. You told me this morning that you'd known from the beginning that using me was costly for me, that you knew and made the decision anyway. Yes, he said. Did you know before or after the first week? A pause. Define knew. Did you understand when you sent me back to my desk at the end of the first week after I found the discrepancy, that you had just made me visible in a way that had operational consequences? He was quiet for 4 seconds, which was, she had learned, his honest answer pause, the pause of a man who was choosing accuracy over comfort. Yes, he said. She nodded slowly. And you didn't tell me? No. Because... Another pause. Because telling you would have required me to offer you a choice, he said. And I wasn't ready to offer you a choice, because I didn't know yet what it would cost me if you made the wrong one. She sat with that. It was a hard thing to sit with. The admission, delivered without softening, that he had made a calculation that weighted his own operational needs against her safety and arrived at a conclusion she hadn't been consulted on. She'd suspected it. Sitting in her kitchen at 4:30 in the morning, running timelines, she'd suspected it. Having it confirmed in the back of a car in a sub-basement garage with the rain muffled above them was a different experience than suspecting it. That was wrong, she said. Yes, he said. That's all. That's the only thing you're going to say about it? I can say more if it's useful, he said. I made a decision that prioritized my operational continuity over your informed consent. I knew the cost, and I didn't share it because sharing it would have introduced a variable I wasn't willing to risk. That was a wrong decision. It was also a decision I would need to make differently going forward, if there is a going forward, which is something I don't know yet because I haven't asked you. Imani looked at him. There it is, she said quietly. There it is, he agreed. You're asking if I'm staying. I'm acknowledging that you have a choice now, he said. A real one. The situation that made the first choice complicated is resolved. Do-hwan is gone. The internal network is dismantled. You could leave this job tomorrow, and the operational threat to you personally would be minimal within 30 days. He paused. I'm not offering you that option because I want you to take it. I'm offering it because you were owed it 6 weeks ago, and I didn't give it to you then. She thought about her apartment, her kitchen table, the notepad, the landlord who now sent cordial messages because the rent was consistently paid. She thought about what her life had looked like before the job listing with 4 lines and no company name, and she thought about what it looked like now, and she thought about the enormous and specific distance between those 2 pictures. I'm not leaving, she said. He said nothing for a moment. Then, why? Because the work is real, she said. Because I'm good at it in a way I've never been good at anything before, which is a sentence I'm only going to say out loud once, so don't ask me to repeat it. And because... She stopped, looked at her hands, looked back at him. Because you're in the middle of figuring out how to be a person again, and you're doing it badly in some very specific ways, and I find that... She considered the word choices available to her. Compelling, in a way that probably says something unflattering about my psychology. The corner of his mouth did the thing. The fractional arrived and gone thing. It says something accurate about your psychology, he said. You're drawn to problems that require sustained, careful attention. That's a clinical way to describe it. Would you prefer a different way? Not right now, she said. Right now I need food and a shower and approximately 10 hours of sleep, and then we can have every conversation that comes after this one. He nodded. She opened the car door, then stopped, turned back. Tae-jun. He turned his face toward her. The blackout curtains, she said. In your office. She paused. Open them. He was quiet for a moment. It won't change what I can see, he said. I know, she said. Open them anyway. She got out of the car. The debrief with Minho took 3 hours and happened in stages. The immediate operational accounting first, then the structural damage assessment, then the forward reconstruction plan that began with the question of what the organization looked like in 11 days when the Harbor Authority Protocol went into effect and required a fundamental restructuring of the waterfront operations architecture. That conversation happened at the conference table in the 42nd floor office, and Imani sat at it as she had sat at it for 2 months, with her notepad, with her precise handwriting, with the capacity to find the number that mattered inside a page of numbers that were designed to obscure it. Except that this time Minho looked at her across the table, not with the careful assessment of a man measuring an unknown quantity, but with something that had settled into the specific register of a colleague. Not a friend. Something more professional than friendship and more human than professional. The look of a person who has been through a thing with someone and has arrived on the other side of it, knowing the relevant facts about who they are. She caught him looking once and held his gaze. He nodded once. She nodded back. That was all it needed to be. The Harbor Authority restructuring was going to be significant. Imani had been building a picture of it since the moment Do-hwan's timeline had clarified the regulatory window. The new inspection protocol wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a fundamental reconfiguration of how legitimate and semi-legitimate shipping operations could coexist under the same administrative architecture. What it meant practically was that the shell companies needed to be dissolved and the legitimate subsidiaries needed to be substantially restructured so that the compliance burden fell on entities robust enough to carry it without creating paper trails that retroactively implicated everything upstream. It was, she thought, looking at the organizational map she'd been building on the secondary conference table for the past 90 minutes, the most complicated financial restructuring project she'd ever seen. It was also solvable. She could see the shape of the solution the way she could always see the shape of solutions, as a sequence of logical steps, each one contingent on the one before it, the whole thing moving toward an endpoint that was both clean and defensible. She had never been more professionally engaged in her life. That fact was, she acknowledged, going to require some reflection at a later date. Tae-jun worked beside her through the afternoon, not at the conference table but at his own desk, on the phone, rebuilding the communication channels that the Sung and Park revelations had compromised. She listened to him work with the peripheral attention she'd developed over 2 months, the part of her awareness that tracked him without being consciously directed at him, the way you learn to monitor a sound that matters without letting it interrupt everything else. His voice was doing a specific thing today that it hadn't done before, or that she hadn't heard before, a quality that she thought might be, if she were being precise about it, the sound of a man who has set something down that he'd been carrying for a long time and is still adjusting to the change in weight. At 4 in the afternoon, she looked up from the organizational map and saw that the blackout curtains had been moved. Not fully open. A hand's width. Maybe less. A narrow vertical line of Seattle afternoon light, gray and rain diffused, February light that had no warmth in it but was undeniably light, crossed the desk from left to right, landing on the surface approximately 8 inches from where Tae-jun's right hand was resting. He couldn't see it, but it was there. She looked at it for a long moment and said nothing. The cleanup of the internal network took 11 days. Not coincidentally, the Harbor Authority protocol gave them a deadline that structured everything else, which Imani suspected Tae-jun had recognized from the beginning as useful. A deadline with external legitimacy was cleaner than a deadline born of internal urgency. Rhee was removed from the Portland operation, and his forwarding agreements were terminated with a legal documentation trail that Imani built with meticulous care, because the one thing that would compound the damage was a messy severance that created its own paper problems. Sung's operational territory was redistributed across 2 captains who had been on Minho's short list of trustworthy personnel, quiet men who had demonstrated over years the specific quality of doing their work without requiring their work to be noticed. Park Yoon-seok surfaced in Vancouver 3 weeks after the processing plant. He made contact through a third party, testing whether there was a version of conversation available to him. Tae-jun received the contact and said nothing for 36 hours and then sent back a single response: the date of the Harbor Authority protocol's implementation and a list of the shell companies that had already been dissolved, which collectively represented everything Park had believed he was building toward when he'd spent 11 years constructing his position inside the organization. Park made no further contact. The third source, the person Tae-jun had been working toward identifying before the processing plant, the one whose existence had expanded the problem beyond Sung and Park, turned out to be a junior logistics coordinator named Baek, who had been recruited by Park 18 months earlier using a combination of financial leverage and a manufactured personal crisis that Minho, when he found the full picture, described to Tae-jun with a specific flatness in his voice that communicated exactly how thoroughly the manipulation had been executed. Baek was 23 years old. The conversation Tae-jun had with him lasted 40 minutes in the main conference room. Imani was present. She had been present, she understood, because Tae-jun wanted a witness who would give him an accurate account of his own behavior in the room afterward. Someone who would tell him honestly if he'd handled it correctly, because correctly mattered to him in ways that had nothing to do with optics and everything to do with a standard he'd been holding himself to for reasons she was still understanding. He handled it correctly, not gently. Tae-jun was not built for gentle, but correctly. He laid out what they knew. He allowed Baek to give his account. He asked 3 questions that were precise and gave Baek the room to answer them completely. And at the end of it, he told Baek that he would not be prosecuted and would not be harmed and could leave Seattle with enough money to start elsewhere and the understanding that coming back was not an available option. Baek left the room in the specific way that people leave rooms when they've been shown a larger mercy than they'd braced for and haven't yet figured out how to carry it. Minho watched him go and said quietly, so that only Tae-jun could hear, "That was more than he deserved." "He was 22 when Park recruited him," Tae-jun said. "At 22, I was doing things I'm not able to justify in retrospect. The difference is nobody gave me a way out." He paused. "Give him one." Minho gave him one. The Harbor Authority restructuring was completed in 9 days, 2 days ahead of the protocol's implementation, which Imani considered an acceptable margin given the complexity of what they'd dismantled and rebuilt. The legitimate subsidiaries were now carrying the compliance burden cleanly, structured in a way that met the new inspection standards without creating the retroactive exposure she'd been most concerned about. The shell company dissolution was documented, filed, and legally complete. She set the final filing on Tae-jun's desk on a Wednesday afternoon when the rain had finally, for the first time in 41 consecutive days, stopped. "It's done," she said. He ran his fingers across the top page, not reading it, feeling it, the weight of paper, the fact of it existing. "Walk me through the final structure," he said. She walked him through it. 20 minutes. He asked 7 questions, all precise, all exactly the questions she would have asked if she'd been receiving the information rather than presenting it. His grasp of the restructured architecture was complete by the end of it. She could tell by the specific quality of his silence, which had shifted from listening silence to knowing silence somewhere around the 15th minute. "The Portland terminal," he said. "Clean," she said. "The new forwarding agreements are all with entities that can sustain the inspection standard. Revenue will be down approximately 18% in the first quarter while the new relationships establish. And after the first quarter. After the first quarter it recovers," she said. "The new structure is actually more efficient than the old one once it's running. Fewer intermediary layers. Less friction. The 18% was mostly the cost of the layers we were maintaining for reasons that stopped being relevant approximately 8 years ago." He was quiet for a moment. "You're saying the old structure was inefficient. I'm saying it was built for a regulatory environment that no longer exists and nobody updated it, which is the kind of thing that happens when the people responsible for maintenance are too focused on the current problem to audit the underlying architecture." She paused. "It's very common. It's also fixable. We fixed it." He almost smiled. She was getting better at reading the shadow of it, the specific tension in his face that preceded the expression he didn't quite let arrive. She no longer needed it to arrive fully. The shadow was enough. The shadow was, in its way, more his than a full smile would have been. "Sit down," he said. She sat in the chair across from his desk. He was quiet for a moment, and she waited, because she had learned, 2.5 months of learning, that his silences were productive and deserved their full duration. "The position," he said finally. "What about it?" "The temporary arrangement ends," he said. "The original contract was a 4-week trial. We are 11 weeks past that." She looked at him. "I noticed. I should have addressed it formally before now." "You've been busy." "That's not a reason." He turned his face slightly away, the particular angle he used when he was organizing something he wanted to say correctly. "I want to offer you a permanent role. Chief Strategist. The title is accurate to what you've been doing for the past several weeks, and the compensation would reflect that accurately. The role would include organizational scope beyond the immediate office, the full operational picture, not just the 42nd floor." She looked at her hands. "That's a significant offer," she said. "It's an accurate one," he said. "The alternative is that I hire 3 people to do what you do, and none of them do it as well, and the efficiency loss is considerable." He paused. I'm also offering it because I want you here. Those are two separate things, and I think you should know they're separate. She was quiet for a moment. The compensation, she said. What range are we discussing? He told her. She kept her face completely neutral through the number because keeping her face neutral was important when the number was high enough to change the long-term shape of a person's life, and she didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing exactly how high it was relative to what she'd been operating with before. I'll need to think about it, she said. Of course, he said. I'll have an answer by Friday. Of course, he said again, and his voice had the warmth of a man who already knew the answer and was allowing the form of the decision to be hers. She accepted on Thursday. The structural changes to the office happened over the following 3 weeks, and Imani was involved in all of them. Not because Tae-jun asked her to be, but because she showed up to the meetings with the contractors and the adaptive technology consultant and the acoustic engineering firm that Minho had sourced, and she asked questions and took notes, and occasionally redirected conversations that were drifting toward solutions that were technically correct but practically wrong for the specific person they were designing around. The adaptive technology consultant, a woman named Dr. Chen, who had 15 years of experience and a specific quality of professional directness that Imani immediately respected, asked during the second meeting whether Tae-jun had been consulted on his own preferences for the redesign. There was a brief silence in the room. He'll say he doesn't have preferences, Imani said. He'll say whatever is functional is sufficient. Don't accept that. He does have preferences. He knows exactly how he wants this space to work. You need to ask him the right questions, which are not, what do you want, but describe what goes wrong in the current setup. He'll answer that honestly because it's a problem-oriented question. Dr. Chen looked at her. You know him well, she said. I know how he processes information, Imani said. It's not the same thing. But it was starting to be, and she knew it, and she filed that knowledge in the same place she filed other things she wasn't ready to examine in full daylight yet. The tactile markers went in first. Discrete, precisely placed, calibrated to the specific geography of how Tae-jun moved through the space based on observations that Imani had been accumulating without entirely realizing she was accumulating them. The desk stayed exactly where it was. The credenza stayed exactly where it was. The positions were perfect. What changed were the edges and transitions, the places where one surface ended and another began, made legible through texture rather than sight. The encrypted audio system replaced 3 of the administrative processes that had required Imani's direct involvement to function: document dictation, calendar management, certain categories of communication, not all of them. The ones that required interpretation, judgment, the reading of a situation rather than the reading of a text, those remained hers. The acoustic engineering turned out to matter more than anyone had initially anticipated. Small changes. The way sound moved in the room, the placement of materials that absorbed or reflected differently, the elimination of a persistent low-frequency hum from the HVAC system that nobody had consciously noticed, but that Imani, once the engineer pointed it out, realized she had been filtering around for 2.5 months. When the work was done, Tae-jun walked through the completed office alone. Imani stood in the hallway outside the closed door and waited. He was in there for 11 minutes. When the door opened, he stood in the frame for a moment, not oriented toward her, just standing, and his face had the quality of a person who has been handed something they had stopped expecting to receive and hasn't yet found the category for it. The hum is gone, he said. The HVAC was creating interference, she said. You never mentioned it. I assumed it was permanent. Most things that seem permanent aren't, she said. He turned toward her voice. Come in, he said. She went in. The curtains were open. Not a hand's width. Not the narrow line of gray light that had been crossing his desk for the past 3 weeks. They were open fully on one side. The north-facing window, the one that got the most consistent indirect light through the day. And Seattle's afternoon came into the office in a way that it hadn't in years, softening the edges of everything it touched, and laying itself across the walnut desk, and the credenza, and the tactile markers, and the precisely organized architecture of a life that had been rebuilt inside this room. He couldn't see it, but it was in the room with him, and he had opened the window for it, and she thought that was the most honest thing she had seen in a very long time. She went to her desk, the desk that had been moved from its original position to a more central location by her request, because the original position had always been slightly too far from his for the working rhythm they'd developed. And she sat down and opened the morning's documentation. "Revenue summary from Portland came in," she said. "Read it," he said. She read it. The numbers were better than projected, which she had expected but didn't say, because expectation and result were two different categories, and the result deserved to be heard on its own terms. When she finished, Tae-jun was quiet for a moment. "The 18%, he said. "Down to 11, she said. "First month under the new structure. Faster than you projected. "The new forwarding relationships established quicker than I modeled for," she said. "The partners are more efficient than the intermediaries we were using. I accounted for a longer ramp-up. Adjust the second quarter model." "Already done," she said. A pause. "Of course it is," he said. She wrote something in her notepad. He picked up his coffee, to the right of the phone, exactly where it belonged, exactly where it always was, and drank it without looking for it, without hesitating, with the specific ease of a man moving through a space that had been made honest around him. She watched that and said nothing, and felt something settle in her chest that had been looking for a place to land for a long time. The afternoon moved through the office the way Seattle afternoons moved in the brief windows when the rain stopped. Slowly, gray-gold, with a quality of suspension, as if the weather was deciding whether it had finished with you yet. Imani worked through the documentation, flagged two items that required Tae-jun's attention, read them to him when he asked, received his responses, noted them, moved on. At 3:15, Minho came through the side door with the week's security report, which was the first security report in 11 weeks that contained nothing requiring immediate action. He set it on Tae-jun's desk, and Imani read the summary and then the full document at Tae-jun's request. And the three of them went through it with the specific quality of people who have learned to assess the difference between a quiet week and a safe week, and have, for the first time in a long time, encountered a week that was genuinely both. Minho left at 4. At the door, he paused. He looked at Imani. Not the careful assessment from the first day, not the recalibrating look from the re-revelation, not the colleague acknowledgement from the processing plant garage. Something else. Something that had all of those things in it but had moved past all of them into a territory that was simply human. The look of a person who has watched something difficult happen and has seen it resolve in a way that is better than expected and is not quite sure how to hold that, because better than expected is not a category that people in his line of work are encouraged to trust. He nodded. She nodded back. He left. The office was quiet. Imani sat at her desk and looked at the last document in the afternoon stack, a contract proposal from a new legitimate shipping partner that was exactly what it appeared to be, straightforward and clean and requiring nothing more than her signature on the administrative acknowledgement and Tae-jun's authorization on the operational approval. She read it through once, signed her line, slid it across to his desk. "Contract proposal," she said. "Clean. Shipping partner, Seattle to Vancouver, 30-day pilot arrangement." He found it on the desk and ran his fingers along the edge of it. Summary. She gave him the summary in 3 sentences. He authorized it. Found her signature line with his thumb, then moved to his own line and signed with the controlled precision of a man who had learned to write in a straight line without seeing it, the specific discipline of someone who had practiced a thing until the body remembered it, so the mind didn't have to. She took the signed contract back, filed it, looked at the empty afternoon desk. "That's the stack," she said. "Good," he said. They sat in the office with the north-facing window open, and the Seattle afternoon in the room, and the quiet that had developed between them over 11 weeks of working, the specific quiet of two people who have said enough things in each other's presence that silence no longer requires filling. After a while, Tae-jun said, "The light." She looked up. "What does it look like today?" he said. "The light." She looked at the north-facing window, at the way the afternoon came through it, indirect, diffused through the February cloud cover that had returned, gentler than direct sun, the kind of light that made everything it touched look like it was being considered rather than illuminated. "Gray gold," she said. "The cloud cover is breaking up on the north side. There's more warmth in it than there usually is this time of year." She paused. "It's crossing the desk from left to right. It's moving. The cloud layer is moving, so the light is moving. It'll be gone in about 20 minutes when the next bank comes in." He was quiet. "It's on your hands right now," she said. "On the desk. Your left hand." He looked down, the reflex of a person who still sometimes forgot, and had stopped being ashamed of forgetting. His left hand was resting on the desk, and the light was there, moving across the walnut surface and across his fingers with the indifferent, beautiful specificity of light that doesn't know or care who can see it. He sat with that for a moment. "Tell me when it moves," he said. "I will," she said. She watched the light on his hand and the light on the desk, and the way it shifted as the cloud layer moved overhead, slow and irreversible, the way all things move that are larger than the spaces they pass through. 3 minutes later, it had traveled from his left hand to the center of the desk. "It moved," she said. "Center of the desk now." He nodded. 5 minutes after that, it reached the far edge and disappeared into the shadow of the credenza, and the office went back to its usual gray, and neither of them said anything about that. Outside, the second cloud bank came in, and the brief window of gray gold closed, and Seattle returned to its standard February self, persistent, wet, entirely committed to the business of being exactly what it was, regardless of what anyone thought about it. The rain started again at 4:47, first as a sound against the glass, and then as the full sideways assault that the city had been delivering for most of the year. Imani listened to it. Beside her, 10 feet away, Kang Tae-jun reached for his coffee, to the right of the phone, exactly where it belonged, and drank it, and the sound of the rain was steady and indifferent around them both, and the office was quiet in the way that places become quiet when they have stopped being contested and have settled, finally, into what they actually are. She looked at her notepad, picked up her pen, wrote 3 lines of notes about the Portland contract and the adjusted second quarter model and a follow-up item she needed to address in the morning, because work was the current thing, and the current thing required attention, and she had always been good at giving the current thing the attention it required. That was not going to change. Some things about a person are structural, built too deep to be removed by the ordinary catastrophes of living, the jobs lost and the rent overdue, and the desperate decisions made in February. Rain outside a tower with a man behind a desk who heard everything and saw nothing and needed, more than he had been willing to say for a very long time, someone willing to stay in the room. She had stayed in the room. He was still in it. Outside, Seattle kept raining. The cloud layer pressed down on the city the way it always did. Steady, heavy, the specific weight of a place that had decided long ago that gray was not a limitation but a condition, and had learned to be entirely itself within it. Inside the 42nd floor office, the north-facing curtain stayed open. The light would come back tomorrow. Imani would tell him when it moved.